Hello, welcome to EcoTactics Conversation series on environmental research practices hosted at Generation that will take place over the next 8 months. Focusing on exploratory methodologies for fieldwork, ecopedagogy, and environmental literacy, this program weaves together a network of practitioners who have been experimenting with novel approaches for ecological research. EcoTactics invites artists and researchers who develop their work through the fields of art and sound anthropology, media studies, hydrofeminism, and pedagogical activism to address current debates on extractivism and resource politics, oceanography and sonic ecology, the distribution of toxicity, and the circulation of digital media via the lens of practice. Future sessions include guests architect Godofredo Pereira, media theorist and scuba diver Melody Jew, hydrofeminist and director of Field Lab Astrida Neymanis, and artist Haitu Styro. Today, we dedicate our first session to the practice of anthropologist, filmmaker, musician, and sound artist Stephen Feld, who has developed many decades-long research on sonic ecology and the histories of listening in Papua New Guinea, Southern Europe, Japan, and West Africa. Stephen Feld has dedicated his academic research to the anthropology of sound, a term he coined in 1972 to extend the anthropology of music and language into a more critical sensory and aesthetic focus on voice and poetics, all species sound relations, media and technologies, and environmental and ecological acoustics. He works across a multiplicity of media, such as recordings, films, and texts, and is a senior scholar at the School for Advanced Research in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and distinguished professor of anthropology emeritus at University of New Mexico. Stephen's work has crossed various rivers and ecosystems that I'm researching, some of them which I have visited, such as the Mississippi River, and others that remain in a distant imaginary dimension, such as those of Papua New Guinea, that nonetheless lie interwoven by many chemical continuities and histories of listening. Today, he will speak to us about his practice along these years. Welcome, Stephen. It's great to have you with us.
Thank you. Thank you. It's lovely to be here. And I thank you so much for this invitation and the opportunity to meet with, even if virtually meeting, with a whole new group of people. And as I told you last week, I'm so excited by the young generation of scholars and activists working with sound. And it's been really inspiring to me at this point in my so-called retired life to find that there's a generation of people who are exploring things with just a huge passion for changing our environment for the good and for knowing it more closely through sound. You mentioned the anthropology of sound, and so I'll start there. Going back 50 years, I had the very, very good fortune as a music student in university to go to a school where they had the very, very first Moog synthesizer. And that is because that technology was invented in the 1960s by Robert Moog, together with somebody who's actually a jazz musician, a trumpeter named Herb Deutsch, who was a professor at Hofstra College. And because I was studying physics, I got the job as the laboratory assistant and was plunged into this wonderful world of sound technology, analog synthesis technology in the late 1960s. And I began experimenting. I was just a composer and I just was having fun with technology. And then all of a sudden, I met an anthropologist who was working in Central Africa, and he hired me because I had access to technology to transcribe and study music that he had recorded in the rainforests of Central Africa. This is a man named Colin Turnbull. And suddenly, the social world of sound, the world of sound in the rainforests, the world of sound technology, technology for understanding sound, technology for making and creating sound, the world of sound recording in remote environments, understanding an all species, developing an all species approach to recording ethnographically and anthropologically. All of this just started bursting in my mind when I was very young. And so I went to graduate school, and the first book that was presented to us to study was a book called The Anthropology of Music. And we had to write a response. And my first sentence was, "What about an anthropology of sound?" And that was because I had the good fortune to join together this background of anthropology, particularly environmental anthropology of the rainforests in Central Africa, with the world of sound technology. And I was somebody who liked to play with toys. I liked to play with the vocoder. I liked to play with the synthesizer. I liked to play with the theremin. But somehow there was no incompatibility to this kind of playing around with the kind of playing around that was recording ambient sound. And so I decided that I really wanted to study rainforests, because this was a place where you could really take an all species approach, and that there had to be, over the long course of human evolution, a very strong relationship between the sound, environmental sounds, and the practices of the people who lived in a rainforest. So in the mid-1970s, I went to Papua New Guinea as a student, and I spent 2 years living in a rainforest community called Bosavi. And I tried to join together what were the insights of the early days of the environmental movement, the early days of what we now call voice studies or poetics, the technologies of sound recording. I had a Nagra sound recorder and extraordinary microphones and equipment. And I had wonderful teachers, that is, local people who introduced me to the rainforest and its sounds. And then something happened that was really extraordinary. I wanted to learn how to compose local songs, and the people who were the so-called composers began taking me into the forest and teaching me to listen to birds. And when I went to music conservatory, my training didn't include bird call recognition, but all of a sudden I had to learn the voices of 120 some different birds before I could understand anything about melody. I had to learn to listen to the flow of water because singers compose their songs sitting at waterfalls or sitting at the sides of creeks. I began to join together a world of the metaphors of sound: water, flow, pulsation, the sounds of the environment, birds, the different heights and depths of the forest, the niches of the forest. I'd go out into the forest and I couldn't see more than a meter in front of me, and children would take my hand in my parabolic microphone and hold it up toward the trees, and I would be searching around trying to hear a bird, and then they would fix my hand in a place and I would hear the bird in my headphones, and then they would start laughing. And then I began to ask myself, how is it that 11 and 12-year-old children who have no idea what a parabolic microphone or a Nagra recorder is, how can they immediately show me the location of a bird that none of us can see just by listening to its call? The idea that a child of 11 or 12 years old can identify 60 or 70 or 80 species of birds and tell you where they live, what kind of food they eat, when they call, what their migration pattern is, things like that. I realized that there was a profound relationship between the knowledge of the environment and the knowledge that was the basis of musicality. I mean, as people from a very different kind of culture, can any of you, imagine? I mean, just imagine. It sounds almost like science fiction. Can you imagine a culture where the best composers are the best ornithologists? In fact, the only people who can really compose are the people who know this deep history of the birds. And then you turn a straight line into a triangle. This connection between sound and ecology becomes a relationship between sound and ecology and cosmology, because birds are not just birds. Birds are ancestors. Birds are the voices of the past. Birds are becoming a bird is what people achieve through death. And it is an achievement. It's a way of transforming into a presence that is absent and an absence that is present. And so this way in which an acoustic triangle connecting sound and ecology and cosmology linked the world of ecology, environmentalism, the voice, species, environment, the rainforest, and the music. This became my obsession in the mid-1970s, and it's been an obsession ever since. And I've continued to go back to that community, and even up until the moment when COVID had made it not possible to go back there. And I hope to go back this year. In the process of doing all this work, I transformed my idea of anthropology of sound into something I think is a little richer. I realized that the kind of knowledge I was trying to describe, the kind of practice I was trying to describe, and the way I was trying to do an anthropology of sound in sound, that is, I was trying to make recordings that were as important as any of my academic writing, making radio programs, doing sound installations, trying to use the medium that was most important to the Bosavi people, using sound to communicate, not just to do the research and to dialogically edit and audit the research, but to participate with local people in presenting the research. So we made a half a dozen different CDs over the years. And those CDs are all projects where I was able to collaborate with the singers and local people who I'd come to know to really present this world. And I came to call this work acoustomology. I sort of abandoned the term anthropology of sound. I tended to think by the 90s that it was becoming a bit too colonial. It seemed like I had, anthropology had colonized another area, We had anthropology of the body, anthropology of gender, anthropology of the environment, anthropology of the voice. It seemed a bit overwhelming to me. I liked the term acoustomology because it combined acoustics and epistemology, the theory of knowledge and the practice of sound making. And I thought sound as a way of knowing is a better way of describing my practice, and doing it in sound and through sound and collaboratively and dialogically was the best way to proceed. And then something really strange happened at the millennium. I was just about to go back to Bosavi to record and to actually live broadcast the millennium in 2000 from the rainforest. And people called me and said, "You can't die here." I said, what are you talking about? They said, "Steve, you can't die here." And this was a period when logging companies and mining companies were trying to gain access to the rainforest. And I had advocated very strongly for local people, and we had been part of a number of initiatives with NGOs and other organizations to keep mining and logging out of the rainforest. What people were really saying to me was that they felt that my presence there might make them vulnerable, and perhaps me vulnerable, and they would be very unhappy if I would become persona non grata to the New Guinea state as a result of my advocacy. So I was shut down. I wasn't really able to go there. And after 25 years, this was really quite a shock to my system. And as a kind of gift to me, a very close friend named Charlie Kyle and his partner, Angeliki, who were working in Greece with Romani instrumentalists, said, come to Greece with us. Just, get this out of your mind. Let's go to Greek Macedonia. We're working with Romani instrumentalists. We'll travel with them. It's a beautiful season up near the Bulgarian border. Bring your recorder. We'll have fun. And so I did that. And one day, in the first week there, I'm walking in the fields with Charlie, and I start to hear this sound. And I said, what's that? And he said, oh, I guess it's shepherds, And I said, no, the sound. And it was belled goats and belled sheep. And I couldn't see them, but I could hear them, and they were all around me. And I had this intense sensation that I was back in the rainforest, and that this world of goats and sheep sonified the pastoral commons of Greece and, European history in many places, the way birds sonified the history of the rainforest. And, that incredible light bulb went off in my head at that moment. And I looked at Charlie and said, do you think bells could stand to 10 centuries of European history the way birds stand to 40,000 years of rainforest history? And it just I was like melting down in the moment of and so bells became my next obsession. Church bells, animal bells, carnival bells. And I began to trace out another kind of set of connections between sounding and ecology and cosmology. And hanging out with bell ringers in churches and trying to understand the way bells mediated the history of time and the history of labor in many different European places, and looking into the art history of Europe and thinking about all of these, all of the connections, the way in which European history had sounded, the way in which the history of the ownership of land and the commons had sounded through the movement of, and I spent weeks walking with shepherds, and then I went to France, and then I went to Italy, and then I went to Finland, and then I went to Denmark, and then I went to Norway, and I started becoming crazed with this bell story. And it was also kind of funny because for many years, people had said to me, Steve, the stuff you do in New Guinea is really kind of cool, but you could only do that. You could only do that 10,000 miles away in a place where there's 2,000 people living on 500 square miles of land, and they, have only been in contact with the outside world for 50 years, and they're completely remote from the world system. I mean, this is kind of Rousseauian, it's nostalgic, it's this, people were kind of dismissing the idea that sound could so powerfully relate to cosmology and ecology in the history of humanity and our relationship with all of the knowledge we develop about the world around us, and our spiritual connection to it, as well as our environmental stewardship, our sense of what it means to look after the world that we live in. And all of a sudden I realized, wow, bells, Europe, this is perfect. I can just look at people and say, it's not just this remote, crazy, place far away where you can't find me, meet me in a cafe in Europe, and we'll go out into the countryside with some shepherds, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. Or we'll go to let's go to carnival, or let's go to church, or let's go and talk to the people who, control the ringing of the town bells for marriages and deaths and all of these kinds of, so this idea that sound connects very deeply to the history of space and time, and that technologies like bells and birds are the grand mediators of such a story, all of a sudden developed a new kind of power for me. And then I had a wonderful accident. I had a student who was working in Ghana, and I always had read in music books that bells were the timekeepers in Ghanaian music. So I made a deal with her. I said, I'll come and help you with some of the filming that you need for your PhD project, and you can introduce me to some bell makers. And she had been in the city of Accra for over a year and knew a lot of people and knew the city well, and that's what happened. And I went to Accra, and I didn't hear bells. I mean, the first night I was there, I couldn't sleep because I was hearing toads in gutters. And they were croaking all night long because the gutters are 2 feet deep, cement. And the toads are the size of a fist. And when you give a small toad cement like that, it's like giving a teenager an electric guitar and 5 or 6 refrigerator-sized Marshall amplifiers. All of a sudden, you're at a rock concert for 50,000 people. It's an extraordinary history of amplification and the interaction of technologies and nature. And so I began to listen to this, and I was hearing all these kind of crazy things, and I thought, someday I'm going to take these recordings and I'm going to play them for a drummer, and I'm going to really find out something about the history of rhythm here that other people haven't explored. And I did exactly that. And over many years of studying rhythm with a master drummer, I discovered how the toads are the computers, the click tracks, and the time coordinators, because the toads actually create the rhythms of 3 against 2, 4 against 3, and 6 against 4 that are the generative mathematics of the 12/8 timeline, which is the centerpiece of what the bells do in Ghanaian music. So all of a sudden, bells led me back into a world of other technologies, other ways of connecting sound as a way of knowing by listening to the environment, and other ways of working with Ghanaian musicians, in this case, professional musicians, to expose what we were doing. And it struck me all of a sudden that one of the conceits of the Western world that I had grown up with as a student of mathematics was that the notion of infinity was only something that you could derive from the advanced kind of mathematics, algebraic and geometric mathematics and trigonometry of the West. That is wrong. I found that, you can create exactly the same sophisticated intimation of infinity through the world of listening to toads in gutters and interacting with Ghanaian percussionists. And if that wasn't enough, I then began to listen to car horns and found that there was a band of musicians who took car horns off of old trucks, circular squeeze bulb klaxon car horns, and turned them into musical instruments, but only played them for the funerals of truck drivers. And all of a sudden, once again, I'm connecting ecology, the history of motion, transport, trucks, the road, the sound of car horns, the connection between sound and music and technology, and the cosmological world, the way in which the driver's road to a heavenly place was paved with the sound of car horns, just the way that a jazz musician's path onward into the world of transformation is paved with the sounds of trumpets and trombones and street parades in the New Orleans jazz funeral. And so I began to make a series of connections that, again, horn to horn to horn, from animal horn to car horn to trumpet horn to, the rejoice when you die of brass band funerals. all of this is a way to say that what might appear to be a set of very exotic and old school interests, things that we did in the 1970s in anthropology, are not exotic at all. And it's just a matter of an openness to exploring how in each and every environment there's a history of listening. And if you listen to that history of listening, and that's what I call my practice, listening to histories of listening, that's the main method of an acoustomology, of understanding sound as a way of knowing the world. You can explore many different kinds of dualities, triangles, and more, many different kinds of ways that cosmology, ecology, and sound have come together in human history. And you can collaborate with many different kinds of indigenous artists, as well as indigenous activists, to bring the importance of this knowledge and what it stewards, what it looks after, in places from the far remote indigenous world to worlds that are much closer, and worlds that many of us are concerned about, the worlds of our very own neighborhoods, the water systems, the trees, just I live in a high mountain desert at 2,500 meters. And what beetles have done to our pine trees here is something I think about every day, because I've lived with these pine trees and juniper trees for a long time, and they mean a lot to me. And so, I've been involved, it turns out that the person who figured out the solution to this issue is a composer who created a circuit so that the Epps beetles that destroy our trees here destroy themselves by listening to their own sound through contact microphones placed in trees. So connecting the world of environmental solutions and environmental problems and environmental transformations is not really all that far away. And, I'm working with the Bosavi People's Fund in Papua New Guinea, where people are using sound as an environmental advocacy tool. I'm doing similar kinds of things in places in Europe, as well as in Africa. And I think the connection between research and activism, which is so important to many of us, the connection between research and presenting the astonishing diversity of human history and environments in sound, is something that's just going to be, an endless project. And I'm deeply inspired by the work of young people. And I really thank you, Margarida, for inviting me to come today and tell a little bit about how my history intersects with the ongoing history of yourself and the work of young researchers and activists in the world of sound.
Thank you, Stephen. It's great to listen to such a wide path over so many histories of listening. And we have some people online. I want to invite everybody to write questions on the chats or on the comments, no matter the platform you're on. And I can read some to Stephen and we can have a conversation. So I will be mediating. And feel free to write in social media or YouTube. So we'll be sharing your questions. And meanwhile, Stephen, I was really curious in terms of the Bosavi Foundation that you're working on in Papua New Guinea, that you use sound as an advocacy tool. How is it operating and what kinds of strategies, what kind of projects are they developing?
Yeah. This actually goes back a long way. It's a great question. I'm really happy to answer it. And I should just say first that there are probably some people listening who've heard me speak about these things in the past or read articles that I've written about them. So I'm sorry for the redundancy. But in 1983, I had the good fortune to meet a musician who's become one of my closest friends, and that's Mickey Hart, the percussionist of the Grateful Dead. And Mickey heard a radio program that I produced called Voices in the Forest, and got very, very interested in the percussive history of sound making in the rainforest and the history of drumming there, and offered to sponsor my research. And that led ultimately in 1991 to the CD recording Voices of the Rainforest. Voices of the Rainforest presented 24 hours of sound, the Bosavi rainforest and the people, and all the ways the songs of work and leisure and ritual interacted with the rhythms of everyday life and the sounds of everyday life. And we put out that record, and some of you might, have experience making sound recordings and publishing them, and realizing that, if you can sell a few hundred copies, you're doing very well. This thing sold 50,000 copies in about 6 months. That wasn't because of me. That wasn't because of the Bosavi people. That was because of the Grateful Dead. Every time they played, 200 to 500 copies of the CD sold. And I went into the project saying to Mickey Hart that I will do this with you, and but let's make a deal. Neither of us will take any money. Everything will go to the Bosavi people. And Mickey's wife, who's an environmental lawyer, Carol Hart, helped me to start the Bosavi People's Fund Foundation. So for 30 years, Bosavi people have received all the royalties of this CD. And the money from that CD has, in the last 20 years, retained an environmental lawyer in Papua New Guinea to support advocacy. And that is how we have kept mining and logging out of that rainforest for all of these years. So we're directly using something like sound recording, and now we've turned it into a film with the help of Mickey and George Lucas and Skywalker Sound. And so these funds, in the last 2 years, they've directly supported us so that we've managed to keep COVID out of the rainforest. But in terms of keeping logging and mining out and supporting schools and medical initiatives and keeping people there, supporting education, bringing local people into the school system there, and creating, a variety of locally driven sustainable initiatives. We've been able to, channel the funds from sound recording and radio and sound installation and film work back into direct environmental and social advocacy for the Bosavi people. I mean, isn't it an extraordinary irony of high capitalism that a group of 2,000 people in a rainforest have for 30 years made more money from music royalties than all of their neighbors combined have made from selling the rights to logging and mining in their forests? I mean, to me, it's an extraordinary thing. I don't say that because I think I'm a hero or want anybody's applause. I say that because I think this is a kind of history that seems ironic and bizarre, but it could be the history all over the place in New Guinea. Bosavi doesn't have to be the idiosyncratic example. It could be the norm if we could just figure out the way to change our thinking and, work as NGOs and as researchers and as advocates with local people to make this kind of thing happen. And so it just really requires a lot more dreaming and a lot more, creative use of research than most of us have ever been used to.
And sometimes a lot more hacking. I feel that we are hacking into different kind of financial loops here, into diverting accumulation of value in terms of protecting ecosystems or certain practices that are vulnerable and certain communities that are vulnerable. So I feel that it could be one of the paths that we could have, as in being the circuit benders in a system that is fragile and where empathy and emotions and the impacts of creativity, and of curiosity really kind of shapeshift the detours of some kind of political space that we operate. And I have a couple more questions. I still want to invite people to write questions on the chat, and feel free to not be shy, and I'll pass them around to Stephen. But I was really kind of grounded by this image that you brought when you were in the rainforest in Papua, and you were listening to these kind of 60 birds. And there's this young man that can locate and identify these birds, out of the blue, with his knowledge that is so deep into this kind of this broad cosmology of the rainforest, and listening to, the diversity of every bird call, and knowing how these birds are feeding, all their habits. I was really fascinated by this moment. It really kind of captured me. And then I was thinking, and maybe you've already kind of answered much of it throughout your talk, but that's a question that's on my mind lately as I write. And I think it relates a little bit with this space, which is, how can an active form of listening be a form of restorative listening? How can listening be an act of repair?
Mm-hmm. Well, what inspires me in response to that question and that general issue, Margarida, is to just think in terms of the way that all relations between humans have to be reimagined equally as relations between species, spirits, materials, and places. And we have to understand in I think a much more profound way the scale of of the human in this kind of world. We tend to think of, because of our destructive capacity and our technological power, we tend to think of the human as a dominant force in the world. And if we could reimagine the way in which our dominance should be understood relationally as a position of learning with and learning from, and responding to a world, we would be much more open to and able to restore and look after things than I think we are at the moment. And I've experienced this in a number of ways in my own practice and history that I've written about, and I've made recordings to try and illustrate what it means in the moment to come into a place where something that might seem a passing sound or a passing thought or a passing interaction, if you take it and you turn it into something that you really obsessively focus on, if you take a little stretch of time and you keep expanding it and expanding it, if you work on, time as an artist, or if you work on the space in which something happens and magnify it and magnify it and amplify it and amplify it, you have the possibility to take things that might seem small or might seem like they're just passing by, and turning them into, things that require great concentration. What does it mean to take a minute and a half of sound and edit it and understand all of its potentials and, spread it out over 60 minutes so that people can listen to that? I was telling you a little earlier about a recording I made called Suikunkutsu in Japan at the Enkoji Temple in Kyoto. And there's an underground water installation. Water drips from a chozubachi, from a stone, through a double ceramic in the ground, and then it resonates up through bamboo tubes that go along the pathway to a temple where tea ceremonies are performed, and this is a very important instrument for solace. But you walk by it quickly. What happens if you take a minute and a half of that sound, which is what I did, and then I wrote out the mathematics of what would happen if you take that minute and a half and you transform it every way imaginable. I was inspired by John Cage taking a small minute and 13-second segment of audio tape and making 100 copies of it, and then cutting them up and putting them in a paper bag and shaking them and editing them. And I just thought of that as a way to promote deep listening, which was also a way that absolutely forces you simultaneously to blow something up. But then I made the recording in such a way that as you listen to it, you experience an intense desire to keep turning the sound down until it's at the point of just the edge of consciousness. And that way of bringing you into a situation where you are forced to recognize the relationship between the diminution and the amplification of space and of time seems to me to have great artistic potential to connect deep listening and restorative practice.
Interesting. I'll have to look for the recording to think about it further. And we have a question from one of our viewers, from Jennifer Spector, that I'm going to read for you. So Jennifer says, "We've always appreciated the words of Ashbery's, quote, 'The poem should be the possibility of everything we have as experience,' end of quote. And I wonder, in light of your long practice, how do you perceive the ways in which language is affected by the cosmology and ecology of the great sounding rainforest and species? And how may you use of language and communication delve and evolve with all that is here? Can you respond or learn from it?"
I think I went to the rainforest in New Guinea with the idea that there must be a history of heightened acuity of listening. But I hadn't even begun to consider the possibility that the environmental conditions of listening could actually condition the elements of grammar. Why would you develop a grammatical system in a language which has a marker at the end of a word which indicates whether you're calling out or you're hearing something back? Why would you take all of the different sounds of the language and be able to use them not just for, words that indicate primal things, like the sound ah is the word for house, or the sound e is the word for tree, but also use each one of those sounds as a poetic marker of the height and depth of space. It's like, Jonathan Swift in Gulliver's Travels, creating a place called Lilliput, which, is tiny. And the native English speaker knowing that the I sound is used for things that are diminutive. So this kind of connection between the world that lives in the mouth of the poet, of the artist, and the world of listening and sounding is also part of this world called song composition. And so, I found many different ways that the languages in rainforests tend to mark whether evidence is visible or not visible, or audible or not audible. Why would a grammar of a language mark something that's only knowable because it's audible, but that it's outside of vision? So there's obviously a deep evolutionary way that poetry connects the possibility or the imagination of evolving in a particular kind of environment and echoing it back. In 1977, when I read Murray Schafer's book, The Tuning of the World, he said humans echo sound environments or soundscapes in languages and musics. And I thought, well, that's an interesting idea, but it's, it really needs to be documented, developed considerably more. And so a lot of my research was about that, and particularly the way in which sound and making sound is so connected to the sensibility of presence. I just give a very small example that really struck me when I went to Bosavi. When you sit around with a group of people in the rainforest and they're talking, women always would hold the infants in their laps and face the infants outward into the group so that the infant becomes a participant. And when I say infant, I mean a child that is pre-lexical, a child that's not even uttering, single words. But every time somebody makes eye contact and addresses that child, the mother would hold the body, bring the hands around into the shoulders of the child, gently bring the child forward and go, eh. And the child would learn to echo the mother and go, eh, which means yes. So even pre-lexical children learn how to use a sound to be present, to interact. I'd never been in a place where infants were so much interactional participants and collaborators. And the way they collaborate is by overlapping and alternating sounds, just like the sounds they grow up hearing in the rainforest. The birds, they don't stop for each other. It's not like, I'm talking about a language that doesn't have a word or a concept of interruption. Everything is overlapping. And so an infant, the way you make a child into a human being, into a person, the way an infant who doesn't even speak a word learns to be in the world is itself very poetic. It's by making a sound that overlaps another sound. That is the way in which your voice, your body, your reality, your world becomes, co-present with the world around you. And I was so deeply moved by this when I first saw this practice, and then the way in which, as mothers sing to infants at their breasts or during lullabies, the idea that there's constantly there's ways of sounding. So sounding is being, and the connection between sounding and being and song is the way in which the infant is brought into the world through poetry, is brought into the world equally as a poetic participant, is really taught that to be in the world is to be poetically in the world, with a sound that resounds another voice, other voices, other presences.
That's beautiful, Stephen. And actually, I think it links with the question that I had when I was rereading parts of your book today, and that I would like to hear you a little bit on what could be the role of songs and the ceremonial towards ecological conservation, perhaps bringing in examples of different places that you visited.
Mm-hmm. When I went to Papua New Guinea, one of the things that I learned about right away is that if you want to compose songs, you have to know the names of places. In fact, the name of a place, even with people who don't know each other, becomes very profound. We're in a place right now called cyberspace. if I had met you in Portugal, or if I had met you in Lisbon, or I had met you in London, I could call you my London or my Lisbon. If you had met me in Santa Fe or Albuquerque, you could call me my Albuquerque, my Santa Fe. This is a way in which place connects person and experience. Now, I can call you my generation, or my Braga, or my internet, or my whatever, right? And you could call me that. But the point is that these names are reciprocal. And it is a way of saying you and I shared a moment in that space and in that time. So once I began to understand that, it gave me a window into these songs. So to make the story short, over 25 years, I recorded about 1,000 songs. And in those 1,000 songs, there's about 7,000 place names. And then you think about it. Well, poetry is not just cartography. It's not just an exercise in mapping the world that connects biography and memory and environment and place. It's a way in which, there's a transmission of historical value and historical consciousness. Poetics is the root of historical consciousness, and it proceeds through these place names, and these place names become the maps of experiences, the maps of memory, the real material that connects people historically, emotionally, experientially, and so forth. And then we realized, of course, that this also, in a culture that's oral and that doesn't have, maps, that it has a profound political value. So we went up in helicopters with local people, and we put GPS points on all of the place names in those songs. And of course, that turns the songs into land title. And so the profound political power of all of those names, which is a way of saying, we live here, we've lived here, these songs map the history of our living here, all of the ways our clans, our lives, our individual families, our, where we gardened, where we ate, where we swam, where we went fishing, where we hunted, where we did all of these things. This becomes a very, powerful way of connecting history and politics. So I thought, well, in New Guinea, this was very important, and place names turn out to be important all over New Guinea in songs and in stories. It also turns out that in Accra, it was the same thing. The songs that are sung by the drivers are all about the history of the roads that they opened. And so the history of the pioneering history, the cartography of songs and the cartography of the roads, and writing the real history of the transformation of the colonial era road building and driving practices is held in the songs. So how many ways are songs connected to geography? Who knows? I mean, everybody talks about the song lines of Australia, but think about the way in which country songs are so importantly infused with place names. Think about the ways in which place and nostalgia and memory is so much part of the emotional constitution of song poetics in many cultures and traditions, whether we're talking about Inca in Japan, or country songs in Brazil, these things are not just exotic factors about the indigenous remote world. They're things that need to be explored, in a truly global kind of context.
Thank you, Stephen. We have another question from an audience member, from Luis Pinto, and I'm going to read it. How much of your research has to do with documenting, and how much is an attempt to recreate or emulate natural sounds?
Great question. It keeps changing. It's really wonderful. Sometimes something starts as a process of documentation, and then it moves into something that is much more and artistic, transformation. So, for example, I told you about the car horns in Accra. I recorded 2 different CDs, I made 2 different films, and I've done a book about that history. And now, during COVID, it just so happened that friends of mine in Texas and New Orleans and musicians here who've loved those recordings and loved that music, brass band musicians, said, what do you think? Should we get together and create versions of those things? So we have recordings of, musicians in the US, and I sent them back to Africa, and they said, yeah, and we'll overdub ourselves. And so anyway, I'm in the midst of making a CD, producing a CD that's called Horn to Horn, a call and response project of blues and soul music from the southern US and African American and Mexican and Latin American and Anglo musicians from the southern US who are connecting with the car horn sound of West Africa. So here a process of documentation becomes a process of enlarging a way of listening across cultures and spaces and creating new possibilities for collaboration and juxtaposing sounds and cultures and remixing. So I think that, a really important process for connecting documentation and art making is this idea of remixing. What does it mean to, take documentary materials and try to sensitively think about ways in which they can be, the source of new conversations, new artistic or documentary conversations. So we're bringing New Orleans funeral music to Africa as much as we're bringing African car horn music to New Orleans. But the idea is, what happens when people listen to each other and decide that that listening is the basis for a new kind of conversation? It seems to me that this is where the inspiration of art making and the inspiration of documentary field work really can create some real fireworks, and where people reimagine their connectivity, or reimagine their history, reimagine their community. These are totally separate histories, the New Orleans jazz funeral and the car horns in Accra, but they are now, kind of putting themselves in dialogue to say, we hear you. And I think that simple statement, we hear you, you hear us and we hear you, is something that's artistically very, very powerful, something that's culturally powerful, something that can really advocate for, a cosmopolitan ethics of hearing and a cosmopolitan ethics of art making. And after all, I mean, we need to think about interspecies cosmopolitanism, inter-environmental cosmopolitanism, and interpersonal cosmopolitanism. We need to rethink the cosmopolitan project in every kind of way if we're going to be able to work together artistically to, understand environments as deeply requiring our stewardship. So, I see the documentary impulse as, profoundly as a starting point, but not as an ending point, as a way to incite conversation, not as a way to close it.
We're coming to a close, Steve, but maybe I have a last question, which comes in the sequence of what you just said. We hear you. I think much of my thinking lately is set on the space of the unheard and what lies beyond the thresholds of the auditory space of humans. So maybe stimulating a little bit here the space of sensory ethnography and the subsonic, I would be curious, how do we stimulate modes of attention and reverence towards other than human sensing that lie beyond the limits of the listening thresholds that we know? And what tools and practices could stimulate this? Maybe it's a more speculative question, but it's maybe nice to end with this.
Well, I think, people like you and me need to be working much more with the virtual reality community to deal with this. I mean, to turn this question into a kind of space of creative art practice. We rely much too much on the idea that people in the technological sector, will just come up with and provide us with the tools we need to do different kinds of work and different kinds of art and different kinds of politics. But I think we need to be much more centrally involved in the creation of those tools. I think researchers and people who do the kind of work we do or do the kind of listening we do have to make it clear to the community of people who say, are principally making games or entertainment, that, they need to think in a different way about the concept of entertainment. That these are not just commercial tools for people to have a good time. They're also the tools that can help us, gain the connect to the kind of imagination and work that's necessary to really engage at levels beyond those that we've imagined with the tools that we have at hand.
Thank you. I think I will linger with that idea of the connective imagination. And there is just so much in this hour of conversation. I'm sure the conversations will keep going and many more people will watch the video online, as it will be archived on different platforms. I want to thank all my team, Luis for the invitation, Elidio and Marta for helping out setting this program, and João as well. And thank you so much, Stephen, for joining us today. It was a true pleasure to hear your journey. And I hope we can cross in the near future, maybe even see you in Portugal, who knows? There are plenty of birds we could go and listen here. And for sure, plenty of bells in my neighborhood, no doubt.
Yeah.
And it's an honor. It was really, really great to have you here. The next session is on the 22nd of June with Godofredo Pereira, who's going to be joining us from Porto. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Good night.